That's grim.
Could we go back to your inquiry statement, Constable Fraser? I don't have a lot of questions, but there's a couple of paragraphs at the end of your statement I'd like to ask you about. The first is paragraph 90. I've been asked if race played any part in my actions or decisions, or if I was aware of race played a part in any of my colleagues' actions or decisions. I don't remember if race was a factor, but I can't see how it would be. I would deal with them the same as any other. If it appears that they're not okay with the English language, that would be dealt with appropriately. Same with disability or medical issues. It would all be dealt with appropriately. And if we can move on, please. And respectfully, so appropriately and respectfully, I say deal with people the same way you would like to be dealt with yourself. And I think you covered that before lunch.
Yes.
But I would like to ask you some questions about that. If we can go back up to, so we can see paragraph, at the start of paragraph 90 on the screen. And you were asked if race played a part. I just want to explore that a little bit in relation to what you've told us today. You've talked about seeing two women in cultural clothing.
Yes.
And you've kindly described that clothing to us.
Yes.
And what they were wearing in the living room. And I think you've said there, if it appears that they're not okay with the English language.
Yes.
I want to understand, did you see those ladies in the living room, see the clothing, and assume that they would have an issue with the English language?
No.
And why do you say no?
Because I can't just assume by someone's appearance what they can and can't do, or what I can or can't do. There has to be a bit of communication for me to know. And by seeing someone dressed in whatever manner, I can't just assume that they can't speak English or have cultural or religious leanings whereby, yes, my presence was not allowed.
Okay. Well, just focusing on the language issue. We've heard evidence, and we've talked about this, that Mrs. Rashid
Right.
Can speak English and gave her evidence in English.
Right, yep.
But her mother was not able to speak English, or not able to speak English well.
Right.
And I'm trying to understand how you could have said, if it appears they're not okay with the English language, what was it about the way the mother approached you compared to Mrs. Rashid that made you think there was a language barrier?
To get the impression that English wasn't, the lady wasn't confident with English, it would be a shaking of the hands or no words of English being presented to me.
Is that your recollection of how the mother appeared to you on that day?
Yes.
That she was making, I think the word used at one point was signage or signing.
Right. Yes. That's my overriding memory of the interaction with the female that was in front of me. Mm.
What about Mrs. Rashid, the lady I've told you gave evidence in English?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What about your communication with her?
I don't remember speaking to any female in the house with the cultural clothing, and I don't remember speaking to anybody in the house directly, actually, in English. Yeah.
What was it about Mrs. Rashid? You've talked about the clothing. You said you didn't communicate with her. What was it about her that made you think there would be a language barrier with her?
Is this the lady that I wasn't directly in front of me?
Yes, well, from your description, it would appear to be the...
Uh-huh.
You talked about another lady on the couch with 2 children.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was no English forthcoming from the room, so it was my assumption, after the first person I directly tried to communicate with, that, and there was no English from that lady, that nobody else volunteered any English. So my assumption thereafter was that nobody had a good grasp, if you like, or a grasp of English, or felt confident to speak.
Right. And did you think about addressing the lady sitting on the couch directly yourself?
No.
To check whether she could speak English?
No.
I mean, looking back now, is that something that maybe you think you should have done?
I maybe left the property too quickly and didn't try and engage others, but I may have felt that I had overstepped the mark, that I was far from welcome in the house, and I didn't want to make matters worse.
Right.
And that maybe others, i.e. the CID, would have a better knowledge of what would be occurring. So in order to placate, I certainly felt the right option was to leave. Yeah.
And can you explain to us, we obviously weren't there, can you explain to us how you had that feeling that you were far from welcome in the house? What was done, or what happened that made you feel unwelcome?
It was purely that there was no English forthcoming, and my assumption was that from the lady directly in front of me or anyone else, and that it was causing anxiety to the people in the room. So it was just a sense that I felt the best option at the moment was to leave and seek further guidance.
So when you were there, what was your impression at that time of the reaction the presence of the officers was having in the occupants?
It was causing them distress, yeah.
Thank you.
For a reason I wasn't aware of at the time.
But at that point you left?
Yep. Yes.
Did you do anything to try and find out the cause of that distress, or to raise with the office, the duty sergeant, that there appeared to be some level of distress amongst the occupants?
I don't remember what. Well, there's the radio transmissions, but I don't recall approaching that subject with them. I didn't realise at the time that, yes, it was the fact I was a male person in the house speaking to the females, which wasn't acceptable for them.
Is that now what you think the cause of distress would be?
That's what, yes, that's my belief just now, yes.
Right. But nobody at the time said that was the cause?
No, it was purely the one, we were police, and two, there was no English.
Right. Can we look at paragraph 91, please? You say, I haven't heard or told any racist jokes among police officers. I'm not aware of any racist views held by police officers. I'm not aware of any racial discrimination by any police officers.
Yes.
And is that the current position as well as the position in 2015?
Yes.
How confident are you? I mean, you've told us that you got training in equality and diversity issues in 2009 when you joined the police.
Yes.
How confident were you in 2015 when you were at this house that you would have recognised any sort of racial discrimination?
Oh, I would have recognised somebody being racist. I would. Oh, yeah, I could have recognised that straight away. Yes.
And how confident are you that if someone was telling a joke that was racist or had underlying tones of racism, or views that had racism at the heart of those views,
Yeah.
how confident are you that you could recognise those?
Yes, I could. Yep. Very confident.
And what would you do if you were confronted by someone expressing such views or jokes?
I would challenge it there and then, and then escalate it, report it to my line manager, whoever that would be on the day.
Right. Have you ever come across a situation where you've had concern about comments or views that were being expressed by any officers?
No, no.
And how confident are you that you would be in a position to recognise any, we've heard a phrase, unconscious bias, that people can have unconscious bias and express views or comments that are rooted in that unconscious bias?
If I got the impression anyone held any sort of racist belief or view, then I would recognise it.
We've heard evidence from Mrs. Rashid, and we've talked about her today. Have you? I don't know if you've listened to her evidence at all. Have you?
I haven't followed
Right.
any part of this.
And was that a conscious decision on your part?
Yes.
Right. So your evidence is not influenced by anything you've heard from Mrs. Rashid?
Only what I've come across
All right.
in the media.
All right.
And even then I haven't particularly read it or looked at it.
Okay.
Headlines, that's probably it.
All right. When she gave evidence, I asked her about a comment in her inquiry statement, as I've done with you today.
Yes.
And for anyone listening, it relates to paragraph 42 of her statement. And she said that when the officers, been asked about the officers being in the house that day.
Yes.
She said they were uncaring, and I felt almost like we were being treated differently because we were Pakistani and Muslims. And I asked her about that paragraph in her
Yes.
inquiry statement, and she explained in evidence that they were Muslims, she was wearing a hijab, and she said they felt quite vulnerable at the time, and she thought if it had been anyone else in that living room in that house that day, they would have been treated differently. And I wanted to ask you about that, whether from your recollection and your involvement that day, were they treated differently because they were Muslims and they were Pakistani?
No.
No. If you'd gone into that house that day and it was a white family sitting there with a disabled son, a woman with 2 children and her mother, would you have treated them differently that day?
No.
Looking back now, can you think of anything you could have done differently in relation to Mrs. Rashid and her family?
I could have made a greater effort to understand their anxiety, or as to the furthest I went was recognising that English was a problem for me, but I could have possibly gone further on the day to try and establish what the concern was with me being in the house, with hindsight.
Right. And this may assist the chair because he'll have to look at things and think how they could have maybe been improved. And so thinking back now, can you think of any way that you could have done things differently? Can you help him understand what maybe more could have been done by you?
What more I could have done
Well,
to
you
help
said
the
that you
household?
could have made a greater effort to understand their anxiety.
Yes.
So what would that greater effort have looked like, in a
Speak-
sense?
Well, try and communicate with the others in the room. Try and identify if anybody had any English at all, which I only got as far as the First Lady, and then retreated. Beyond that, and that may have brought me to a greater understanding of the issue. Primarily, I assume, is me being a male person. I don't see much beyond that, to be honest, because my knowledge of why I was there and was slim, so I didn't know what was going ahead. I couldn't tell them. And yeah, English, I very much rely on my mouth more than anything to help me.
So English you've explained, but also if you'd been given more information before you arrived, would that have helped?
I could have attempted further to say, yeah, this is what usually helps. Well, it always helps when you can tell people what's lying ahead and that what is likely to and what is not likely to happen usually makes quite a difference.
So giving people more information about why you're there and what is going to happen, does that help
Yes.
deal with people?
Yes.
You weren't in the position to do that on that day, though.
No.
Could you give me one moment, please?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I've completed my questions.
Thank you. Are there any Rule 9 applications? Miss Mitchell, just Miss Mitchell. Yes, Constable, would you withdraw to the room, please, while I
Yes.
hear a submission? Yes, Miss Mitchell.
Thank you, sir. There are three areas that I would like to explore with this witness. The first is his use of the terminology cultural leanings or religious leanings. It's to ascertain what he means by that term and whether or not he received any race training on such terms. That's quite a discrete, simple point. The second one is, my learned friend asked towards the end of the evidence how confident the witness would be to recognise any racism, and she put to the witness, we've heard a phrase unconscious bias, that people can have unconscious bias and express views or comments rooted in their unconscious bias. And the witness has answered, if I got the impression anyone held any sort of racist views or beliefs, then I would recognise it. And what I would like to explore with this witness is whether or not, first of all, he had training on unconscious bias, whether or not he knows what it is, and whether or not he has himself reflected on it. The inquiry may remember that evidence has been given of witnesses who said that they've done, I think, modules. I can't remember the exact phraseology, but modules of that variety that may have included that. So it's to ask him about that. The third issue is in relation to what he said about the information he obtained from the people within the house. He said that what was requested was their names, address, their date of birth and their place of birth. And it's to explore why that as a particular is necessary. This inquiry will of course understand that a police officer is entitled to ask for name, address, place of birth and nationality if it so requires to do in circumstances where it believes that either a person has committed an offence and ask them that, or if they believe that people have information pertaining to a particular offence. And it's to ascertain why in these circumstances these people were asked for their place of birth. I appreciate that he was not the person who asked this question, but he was there and present and indicated in his evidence that those questions were being asked. So it's to explore that with him.
Thank you. Well, I shall allow you to ask questions in respect of issue 1 and issue 2, but I do not think I would be assisted by further exploration in relation to that last matter with this witness. So can we have the witness back, please? Constable Fraser, you're going to be asked some questions by Miss Mitchell, KC, who represents the families of Sheku Bayo. Miss Mitchell.
I'm obliged. Just 2 particular areas I'd like to explore with you, officer. The first one is a phrase that you used during the course of your evidence. You used the phrase repeatedly, cultural leanings and religious leanings.
Yes.
Now, I would like to explore with you what you meant when you said that phrase.
The cultural leanings and religious leanings, I used that in reference to the practices followed under a particular culture or religion, poorly vocalised. I think I couldn't think of a proper word.
Well, that might assist me with my next question, because what I was going to ask you surrounding that area is, when you received race training, were you told about such phrases, or was such phraseology discussed with you?
I couldn't. I couldn't tell you. I don't recall if it was. I would more than likely suggest it's due to my inability to think of a suitable, appropriate word. Leanings at the time was the best that I could come up with. Practices or beliefs, yeah.
So on reflection, would it be your evidence that was probably your phraseology rather than something
Yes.
you'd been told?
Yes.
I also want to continue to ask you some questions about your training. We heard that you got training obviously in 2009,
Yes.
which by the time 2015 came along was certainly not as long as some of the other officers that have given evidence had been trained. Do you remember much now in 2020? In the 2020s that we're in, do you remember much now about your race training?
No. I think equality and diversity and race training was all in the first few weeks of college. But I don't remember any specifics, no.
And would you personally consider it helpful if you had refresher courses?
Yes. Yes.
I want to ask you specifically about one part of race training, and that is training on unconscious bias. You may have remember my learned friend asked you that before.
Yes.
Do you know what unconscious bias is?
Where people maybe unconsciously express or do specific things without actions they take directly with, for instance, the person may be racist by their actions, but they don't profess to having any racist views.
Have you reflected upon whether or not you may have any unconscious bias?
Yes, I generally reflect after each person I've spoken to as to how I have presented and carried myself, and if I've given the person justice.
Have you ever reflected on whether or not you have any biases in relation to race, unconscious that they may be? Have you ever reflected upon that as a possibility?
No.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Constable, for coming to give evidence to the inquiry.
Thank you, sir.
When I rise, you'll be free to go. So we'll adjourn now until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.